Quite possibly the most famous article of Roman clothing is the toga, a piece of cloth up to 6 meters long draped and wound over the torso, beneath which was typically worn a Roman tunic. They disappeared in late antiquity, in part because fashion shifted and changed as much in the Roman day as it does in ours. Despite millennia separating us from the Romans, and all the fashion changes that happened in the intervening time, we share one major article of clothing with them: pants. These were initially decidedly un-Roman, because they were worn by the barbarians of Central and Northern Europe, as well as Persians and others living in the broader Eastern Mediterranean region, largely excepting Greece. The practice began changing in at least the 60s AD, in large part because the Roman legions stationed in colder regions had begun to wear them, and by the mid to late 2nd century they appear to have been the norm in the Roman world. And we can actually observe this on Trajan's column from the 2nd century, for instance. So why then were they banned in 397, again in 399, and then again in 416, with that last law including a section on the banning of long hair and the wearing of furs? Well, much like the laws issued by Augustus after he took power, these appear to have been morality laws, or at least something similar to them. Roman frontier zones had plenty of contact with the barbarians living on the other side of the Rhine and the Danube, as well as those people living in the deserts of Arabia and North Africa, and after a large number of Goths had crossed the Danube in 376, and then defeated a Roman army at Adrianople in 378, the Roman world increasingly came into very close, very personal contact with those barbarians, to a degree which they had not before. In addition to that contact, there were blurred lines in the Roman world concerning who was and was not a barbarian due to the military at the time, which was actively constructing an image in late antiquity that was barbarized, or at least what they thought barbarians looked like, because it was meant to be both alien and intimidating. In late antiquity, Roman soldiers were apparently stamped or tattooed or branded with something. Historians are not certain what this was, only that it was known as the Mark of the Legion, something which helped mark out the army as a world of its own, distinct from civilian life. Some non-Romans did indeed serve in the military. We know, for example, that they drew recruits as far away as southern Norway, but the point is that the military was constructed to be a world of its own, at one and the same time part of the Roman Empire but separate from civilian spheres of life. Going along with this construction, for instance, was the wearing of long hair, something standard in the late antique Roman military. So what's going on here is that clothing in late antiquity formed part of the battleground in what we today, in modern language, would probably term a culture war, although the Romans probably wouldn't have termed it that. And this did not stop in the 4th or 5th centuries. We know that citizens in 6th century Constantinople, for example, took to dressing in Hunnic fashion, including their hairstyle, the description of which is reminiscent of a mullet, and that others very much did not like this. People that sported this haircut were essentially labeled hooligans. This is all part of military and military-esque fashions coming into vogue in the Roman world in this period, and it caused problems because clothing and hairstyles were part of how people were identified in late antiquity. After the Gothic victory in 378, the rampaging through the Balkans, and then the civil war in the 390s and the riots and massacres of Goths that accompanied each event, fear also entered the equation. So, in 393, when Honorius came to the throne, not only was he a child, being only 10 at the time, but he was also dealing with a country which was facing a significant degree of internal stress. So, the wearing of pants was banned in an attempt to reinforce Roman identity, something which really does not appear to have made that much sense, since this article of clothing had been worn since at least the 2nd century in civilian life, and since at least the 1st century in the Roman military. At this point, it wasn't really new, but in any case, how could this have possibly been enforced? As you may have guessed, it wasn't, because it simply was not able to be enforced at a large scale. Now, this could be enforced in the city itself, and it does seem to have been enforced for a time. So, you could receive anything from a fine to jail time to being stripped of property, but beyond that, it does not appear to have amounted to anything like execution. Once you go beyond the city of Rome, however, this very quickly became a law that sounds nice and has the backing of government in what some saw as a cultural crisis, but many in the military and civilian life had serious problems with legislation like this. In colder regions, it simply was not practical to go along with it. This was not just a matter of fashion in a place like Britain or in military camps along the Rhine, especially in the winter. As time moved on, the laws did continue to stay on the books, but the problems that the Roman Empire faced in the 5th century, a declining tax base, civil wars, the loss of territory, and eventually the collapse of the western half of the state, rendered the enforcement of the ban on pants as something that simply did not warrant any attention. Rome, it seemed, had bigger problems.